Belle Starr was born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848 near Carthage, Missouri. She came from a relatively wealthy Southern family and received a good education, including classical piano and fluent reading and writing. But her path turned after the Civil War, when her family's fortunes collapsed and the region descended into lawlessness. Her brother Bud rode with Confederate guerrillas, and Belle found herself drawn into their world. She married James Reed in 1866, a man with outlaw connections. The couple moved to Texas and had 2 children, but James became increasingly involved in criminal activities, including robbery and possibly murder. After his death in 1874 during a confrontation with lawmen, Belle's association with crime deepened. Belle moved to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, where she became involved with Sam Starr, a Cherokee outlaw. They married in 1880, and together they ran a network of horse theft, bootlegging, and harboring fugitives. Belle dressed distinctively, often in black velvet with feathered hats, and was known to carry 2 pistols. She quickly gained notoriety as the Bandit Queen, a rare female figure among male outlaws. She was arrested and convicted in 1883 for horse theft, serving time in a Detroit prison. Despite her criminal ties, Belle maintained a strong sense of self-presentation, often cooperating with journalists and feeding stories that blurred the line between fact and myth. She emphasized her femininity, intellect, and refinement to contrast the rough image of the Wild West, turning herself into a media figure as much as an outlaw. In the final years of her life, Belle became increasingly isolated. Her husband Sam Starr was killed in a gunfight in 1886. She reportedly tried to maintain control over her land and affairs, but tensions grew with neighbors and even her own children. By 1889, she was living near Eufaula, Oklahoma. On February 3, 1889, Belle Starr was murdered. She was riding home from a neighbor's house when she was ambushed and shot with a shotgun, once in the back and again in the face. She died instantly. The identity of her killer remains a mystery. Suspects included a jealous lover, a disgruntled neighbor, and even her son Eddie, who may have resented her control. No one was ever charged. Belle Starr was buried near her home. Her death sealed her legend, and she remains one of the most iconic women of the American frontier, intelligent, bold, and unafraid to walk the line between society and lawlessness. Calamity Jane was born Martha Jane Canary in 1852, likely in Princeton, Missouri. Her early life was marked by hardship. By the time she was a teenager, both her parents had died, leaving her to care for her younger siblings. In 1865, she moved westward to Montana and later to Wyoming, where she began living an unconventional life, working as a laundress, cook, nurse, and occasionally as a scout for the U.S. Army. She earned her nickname Calamity Jane in the late 1860s or early 1870s. According to her, it came after a heroic act during a battle, though the exact origin is debated. What's certain is that she cultivated a rugged, masculine persona that stood out. She wore men's clothing, rode and shot expertly, swore freely, drank heavily, and told wild stories about her life, some true, many exaggerated. Jane traveled extensively across the frontier, spending time in Deadwood, South Dakota, a lawless boomtown where she claimed a close relationship with Wild Bill Hickok. She insisted she had married him and bore his child, though there is no evidence to support this. Nonetheless, she was known to be in Deadwood when Hickok was murdered in 1876, and she remained deeply attached to his memory for the rest of her life. Though often described as a gun-toting adventurer, Calamity Jane also showed deep compassion. She nursed smallpox victims in Deadwood during an outbreak and cared for the sick during other crises. Her rough demeanor hid a generous spirit, and many frontier communities remembered her for her acts of kindness. In later years, she made a living from her own legend. She performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and other exhibitions, selling autobiographical booklets and posing for photos. She knew her name had become valuable and was willing to trade on it, even if the tales were embellished. Her final years were marked by poverty, alcoholism, and failing health. She often drifted between frontier towns, surviving on charity or small performances. Despite her fame, she lived modestly and struggled with loneliness. Calamity Jane died in Terry, South Dakota, on August 1, 1903, at the age of 51. She had been suffering from pneumonia and inflammation of the bowels. Her final request, to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok, was honored. Today, they lie side by side in Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood. Though much of her life is shrouded in legend, Calamity Jane remains one of the most memorable figures of the American West. She defied gender expectations, embraced the freedom of the frontier, and carved out a life on her own terms in a time and place that offered little mercy to anyone, let alone a woman. Annie Oakley, born Phoebe in Mosey on August 13, 1860, in Darke County, Ohio, was one of the most extraordinary and admired figures of the American West. Unlike many frontier legends, her fame didn't come from lawlessness or outlaw glory, but from precision, discipline, and undeniable talent with a gun. She grew up in poverty after her father died when she was just 6 years old. By the age of 9, Annie was placed in a poorhouse and later sent to work for a family who abused her, a period she referred to as time with the wolves. By the time she returned to her family, she had developed a fierce independence and had already begun hunting game to feed her siblings. She sold the animals to local restaurants and markets, becoming known for her marksmanship by her early teens. Her skills with a rifle were exceptional, and in 1875, at the age of 15, she entered a shooting contest in Cincinnati against Frank E. Butler, a traveling marksman. Annie won the match, impressing Butler so much that he began courting her. They married in 1876 and soon performed together, with Frank eventually stepping back to allow Annie to take center stage. Annie Oakley's rise to fame accelerated when she joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885. For the next 17 years, she dazzled audiences in the U.S. and Europe, performing for royalty and common folk alike. She could shoot the ashes off a cigarette from her husband's mouth, hit dimes tossed in midair, and slice playing cards with bullets. Her timing, grace, and modest stage persona made her a star. Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and other heads of state watched her perform. Legend has it she shot the Kaiser's cigar at his own request. Though she performed in a male-dominated environment, Annie retained a traditional feminine image, often appearing in modest dresses and presenting herself as a proper lady. She insisted on equal pay and carried herself with quiet authority. At the same time, she was a vocal advocate for women's rights, especially the right to learn self-defense. She once offered to form a regiment of female sharpshooters for the U.S. Army during the Spanish-American War, though the offer was declined. Annie's life wasn't without struggle. In 1901, a train accident left her with spinal injuries, and she left Buffalo Bill's show. But after a year of recovery and physical therapy, she returned to shooting exhibitions. Over time, she also appeared in stage plays and continued to perform smaller shows well into her 50s. In 1904, her name was dragged through the mud in a newspaper scandal falsely claiming she had been arrested for theft to fund a cocaine habit. The story was entirely fabricated and involved a different woman using her name. Annie Oakley responded by filing and winning 54 lawsuits against various newspapers, a display of her determination to defend her reputation. She spent her final years in North Carolina and later in Ohio, living quietly with Frank Butler. The two remained devoted companions throughout their lives. As her health declined due to pernicious anemia, Annie continued to give demonstrations and teach shooting to young women, promoting self-sufficiency and discipline. Annie Oakley died on November 3, 1926, at the age of 66. Remarkably, her husband Frank Butler died just 18 days later. The couple had been inseparable for over 50 years. Annie was buried in Greenville, Ohio, beside Frank. Her legacy remains profound. She shattered gender norms in the Wild West without ever abandoning her personal values. Her combination of humility, strength, and talent continues to inspire. Annie Oakley was not just a star of the frontier stage. She was a pioneer for women, a master of her craft, and a symbol of what determination can achieve against the odds. Pearl Hart, one of the most unusual and enigmatic figures of the Wild West, was born Pearl Taylor in 1871 in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada. She came from a respectable middle-class family and received a good education, attending boarding school as a girl. But her life would take a sharp turn away from conventional expectations. As a teenager, Pearl fell for a gambler named Hart, whom she married young. The marriage was turbulent and abusive, and though she left him several times, she always returned, until she finally broke free for good and kept his last name. Drifting through the Western territories, she took on various jobs: waitress, cook, singer, and occasionally turned to schemes and scams to survive. By the late 1890s, Pearl found herself in Arizona territory, where economic hardship and a taste for adventure led her to commit one of the last recorded stagecoach robberies of the American West. In May 1899, along with an accomplice named Joe Boot, Pearl held up a stagecoach near Globe, Arizona. Disguised in men's clothing and armed with a revolver, she robbed several passengers at gunpoint. Despite her efforts to maintain order and reportedly returning some money to those who claimed hardship, the act was a bold crime that shocked the public, especially because it was carried out by a woman. Pearl and Boot fled into the desert, but were soon captured. Her arrest created a media frenzy. Newspapers across the country dubbed her the Bandit Queen, and she played up the attention with charm and wit. At her trial, Pearl argued she had robbed the stage out of desperation to help her sick mother, a claim likely exaggerated but effective in garnering public sympathy. She was sentenced to 5 years in the Yuma Territorial Prison in 1901. During her incarceration, Pearl continued to attract attention for her behavior and unorthodox role as a female outlaw. She was eventually pardoned in 1902 after serving just over a year, reportedly because the governor found her troublesome to manage, and perhaps because her notoriety had run its course. After her release, Pearl Hart disappeared from public view. For decades, her fate was a mystery. Some reports claim she toured briefly in a Wild West show or vaudeville act, but none are confirmed. Others say she lived under an assumed name in Arizona or Kansas, working in obscurity. What is generally accepted is that she died sometime around 1955, possibly under the name Pearl Bywater, in Arizona. Pearl Hart remains a curious anomaly in Wild West history. Unlike many female figures of the frontier, she took up arms not for justice or survival, but for rebellion and notoriety. Her legacy is one of contradiction, both a symbol of defiance and a figure of fleeting fame, remembered less for the crime itself and more for the way she broke the mold of her time. Big Nose Kate, born Mary Catherine Horney on November 7, 1850, in Pest, Hungary, lived one of the most extraordinary and enduring lives among the women of the American frontier. The daughter of a Hungarian physician, she was raised in a cultured, educated household. Her family immigrated to the United States in 1862, settling in Davenport, Iowa. Tragedy struck early. Both her parents died within a short time, leaving the young Kate orphaned at just 17. Thrust into a harsh and unfamiliar world, she made a choice few women of her time dared. She would survive by her own wits. By the early 1870s, Kate had taken on the name Kate Elder and found work in the red-light districts of frontier towns like Dodge City, Kansas. It was a common path for women without support, but Kate stood out. Known for her quick intelligence, fluency in multiple languages, and a sharp tongue, she earned respect in a rough world. Her nickname, Big Nose Kate, may have come from her physical appearance, or it may have simply been part of the colorful naming traditions of the Old West. Kate's legacy is inseparable from that of John Henry Doc Holliday, the famed gunslinger, gambler, and dentist. Their relationship began in Texas in the mid-1870s and continued for over a decade. It was volatile, passionate, and full of loyalty amid chaos. Kate was fiercely devoted to Holliday despite his chronic illness, heavy drinking, and violent lifestyle. Holliday, in turn, trusted her more than most. During their years together, Kate followed Holliday from town to town, Dodge City, Fort Griffin, Tombstone. One of the most notable incidents in their relationship occurred in Fort Griffin, Texas, where Doc had been arrested. Kate, undeterred, created a diversion by setting fire to a nearby building and used the chaos to free him from jail. It was a bold move that cemented her legend as a woman unafraid to confront danger. She was with Doc during his infamous days in Tombstone, Arizona, during the tense build-up to the gunfight at the Oakley Corral in 1881. Though she wasn't directly involved in the shootout, her presence in Holliday's life during this period is well documented. Their relationship eventually ended, likely due to Doc's declining health and his growing distance from everyone around him. He died in 1887 in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Kate never married again. After Holliday's death, Kate drifted through various towns, taking up work as a nurse, boarding house operator, and caregiver. She used different names over the years and avoided public attention, perhaps tired of the notoriety her younger years had brought. She lived for a time in Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico before settling in Arizona. In her later years, Kate lived in Prescott, Arizona, where she eventually moved into the Arizona Pioneers Home, a state-run facility for aging settlers. Despite her humble circumstances, she often shared stories of her past, fiercely defending her version of events and Doc Holliday's character. In 1939, at nearly 90 years old, she dictated an autobiography to a writer, a fragmented, at times contradictory account that remains one of the few first-hand glimpses into her life. Kate died on November 2, 1940, just 5 days shy of her 90th birthday. She was buried under the name Mary K. Cummings in Prescott's Pioneer Cemetery. Remarkably, she had outlived almost all of her contemporaries, lawmen, outlaws, and fellow wanderers of the Wild West. Legend, but this ain't the end of the trail. Click the video below to find out how the most legendary figures of the Wild West met their dramatic, and sometimes downright bizarre, ends.